Hello everyone and welcome to the Dyslexia Life Hacks Show. I'm your host Matthew Head, and in this episode I'm talking to Kate Gladstone. She's the handwriting repair woman and runs Handwriting That Works. Having struggled with handwriting since she was in kindergarten, she's now worked her way up to publishing a book called Read Cursive Fast that has tips and how-tos in reading and writing cursive handwriting. And impressively as well, she has also been a director of the annual American Handwriting Competition for New York State, which is really impressive for somebody who struggled with handwriting as a kid. I will put links to Kate's business and handwriting program in the show notes, which will be available at dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast. Welcome to the show, Kate.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for a very generous introduction. If I may, I would like to update some of the information you found from your research. The annual American Handwriting Competition, which existed until 2000, has for the past 21 years, since 2001, been subsumed into the World Handwriting Contest, of which I am the worldwide director, and we have several national directors.
Oh, wow.
The full name of my business, by the way, is Handwriting Repair, Handwriting That Works, which has not only a website at handwritingthatworks.com, but we also have a website for my newest endeavor, namely my book, Read Cursive Fast, at readcursivefast.com. Regarding that book, it is primarily a book on reading cursive. No writing is required, although, of course, one may optionally write. Several people find that this book helps them to write cursive as well if they actually want to write, well, cursive as we know it in the USA, which tends to be this horrendous, in my opinion, thing that's totally joined and very elaborate and very difficult. However, the purpose of it was more to teach people how to read such handwriting when they encounter it, because many people either have never mastered how to read it, despite whatever number of lessons, have never mastered how to read it or to write it, especially if dyslexia is on the menu. And of course, in other countries, such as the UK, that particular form of cursive is often not recognizable. I know from various of my UK friends and contacts. And it's actually been difficult enough that in many cases in the USA and in other English-speaking countries such as Canada, where such a script is used and is required in at least some parts of the country, there are people who learn such writing at about 7 or 8, the standard age to learn it. But then by the time they're 18, they've forgotten literally every bit of it and cannot read it, let alone write it. Now, my goal is to make sure that people can read cursive, can read whatever type of cursive they see. And aside from that, I also recommend that people should write by hand more sensibly themselves. Now, if this book succeeds, my publisher asked for the Read Cursive Fast book to be the one we'd come out with first. And if that sells well, I will get to do the writing books. But I think since this is the Dyslexia Life Hacks Show, we should open with a story of how this book came to be written, because this relates very closely to dyslexia.
Actually, what I wanted to do was, I'm going to come back to the book later on, but what I wanted to find out a bit more about your personal journey, first of all. And what I wanted to kick off with really was your background in cursive writing. Reading up on my research on you, you really struggled with it.
I would say very much so. People blame struggles with cursive writing on everything from the internet to coronavirus to the wrong political party, they would say, being in the White House, and all sorts of things. But not only was I around much earlier than any of those, but if you look into the history of difficulty reading cursive, there are reports of this going back at least as far as the 17th century. Closer to our time, it's seen in the case of some Dickens characters. And I really doubt that the explanation for them was that they were spending too much time on their mobile phones.
I would assume not. So
certainly could not have been in my case. I was born in 1963. None of my various neurological conditions were diagnosed until I was adult, at which point they were diagnosed at various times. But the diagnosis of dyslexia had actually come before I was able to cope with cursive, let alone with writing legibly in any manner at all.
Yes.
Even though I had been diagnosed with dyslexia at 17, there was really no help on offer, none that worked regarding the writing issues, certainly regarding the reading cursive issues. Mm-hmm. And you have to realize I was 24 and in graduate school before I was able to read cursive, which meant I had gone through life really faking and guessing and looking for other clues to try to figure out the handwriting of, let's say, relatives who wrote to me, send me holiday cards, the handwriting of teachers, on occasion, the handwriting of classmates, for instance. Now, imagine going through life that way and being 24 and in graduate school and not being able to crack a code that one had in fact been taught how to write, that one could laboriously grind out from following a copybook, but could not read it afterwards. I could open a page of a book and I could make some attempt at the appropriate squiggles, but I had to take it on faith that what I had just followed, which I couldn't read, said, honesty is the best policy or something of the sort. Imagine going through life like that, and imagine being a very good reader. Despite the undiagnosed or then undiagnosed dyslexia, I had been reading from an early age. It's simply that my reading process involved a lot of double takes, involved seeing a word. In other words, I could read sentences when I was quite young before I started school, but everything that I read, even though I was reading rapidly, there was always a process of looking at it and having to go over words several times to make sure of the letters. I don't think anyone knew this. In fact, I could say that I didn't know it myself because I simply assumed that everybody read in this way, that was what reading was. If you had asked my parents, they would have said I did not have any problem reading. If you had asked me, I would have said I have no problem. One thing I'd like to point out is that there are two ways in which a person who's asked if he has a problem or she has a problem doing something can answer and say no. No means different things. For many of us, do you have a problem reading things might mean no, because I don't have a problem. But for many of us, we might hear that question and answer no, but really mean no, because I have all these little life hacks that I've invented ever since I was 3 to handle it. And I don't know that these are life hacks because I assume the entire world operates like this.
Yes, quite a lot of dyslexic people think that, don't they? That actually what is quote unquote normal is actually them compensating for being dyslexic.
Exactly. And where it actually got worse, got odd for me unexpectedly, was actually in a high school psychology class. One unit was on perceptions, perceptual abilities, and examples that were mentioned as, this is an example of how people perceive something. This is an example of how one thinks when one is reading or writing or what have you. The examples given would be, this is a mental process. And I would say, no, I don't think that's a mental process because this is quite different from the way I operate. And I would be told I was being the class clown and making attention and seeking a scene, and that if I really thought this way, there was something wrong with me. So in classes where you would think this wouldn't come up, classes where you'd think that you could actually discuss perceptions and one's senses and learn about these, again, you could be embarrassed simply by being honest. I was actually told at one point that I must be, telling horrible, idiotic lies. This sort of thing, you were saying, yes?
Yeah. So really, like, you were just basically told you were giving lies, but actually it was your different perception of the world.
Yes. Yes. In fact, I will tell you, for those of us who have read Harry Potter, the thing in Harry Potter that hit home for me was the 7th book, where there's this horrible teacher, Dolores Umbridge, who punishes students for telling the truth because she tells them that they're telling lies, and she gives them this extremely horrible punishment. Well, fortunately, that was worse than punishments I had, but I certainly did have to write on the board, I will not tell lies. And of course, after having told the truth, and of course had to be laughed at because I was writing it, but writing it in horrendous handwriting, which they thought was my being willful. I would have liked nothing better but to do things correctly. But so many times I was sent to the principal's office, what you would call the headmaster's office.
Yep.
I really knew the staff on a first name basis by the time I'd been at any school I was in for about 2 months. I would, let's just say, because in many situations, it was either believed I was being willful, obstinate, disrespectful by intentionally, goofing off or intentionally making fun of the assignment by not doing it well. And to many teachers, and in fact, to my parents, both of whom had been English teachers for many, many years, although not in the schools that I was attending. They were in a different school. Well, my parents, as well as my teachers, really were at some level from what I gathered from my parents and what my father, now deceased at one point, said to me, and what my mother hinted at one point, although she's now changed her mind. But certainly from my teachers very explicitly, they found it personally offensive on my part that someone who seemed very intelligent, who seemed very diligent, who could do a lot of things very well at school, who could, for instance, win any spelling bee you handed out, as you had her be, and as long as the words were to be spelled out loud and this wasn't a written spelling test. I mean, I did okay at written spelling tests, but there would be errors if I wrote too unintelligibly for the teacher to decipher, even after the teacher had figured out, so to speak, my personal code. But there were people who literally thought it was offensive. How could I do well? We had to take French at one of my schools, and how could I do well in French but have horrible handwriting in French as elsewhere? They thought it was just offensive and frankly ugly. There were, in fact, teachers who required my classmates to make fun of me as a group in hopes that this would teach me somehow to improve. And the classmates went along because they knew that if they didn't participate, they would be singled out next.
So that was really interesting. So you're quite good at spelling. It's the method of using handwriting that is what you struggle with. Yes,
there were times when I got stuck, when I would literally forget how to write certain letters. And I could fake it during the school years up to a point, up to about my 4th year of school, 4th grade. There were letter charts on the walls of schools. You could look at, at basically horizontal strips of giant letters that were posted above the blackboard that were cursive. So even though I couldn't read it, if I needed to know, how to do a capital H or a capital I, among the many other ridiculous looking letters in conventional North American cursive, I could start at the beginning of the alphabet and count along capital A, lowercase a. Okay, this is number 9. This has got to be the capital I. This is the 9th of the capitals. But once those charts went down, suddenly I couldn't do it. And certainly when I was outside of school, one of the bitterest memories of my life is actually being on vacation with my parents, and we were having a great time. We'd actually gone on vacation to the NASA headquarters in Alabama, which has lovely tours of the space facility. And Mom always made us write letters to relatives who weren't with us, particularly to, our grandparents, as one of them was her mother, Grandma Helen. Well, I had to write, and in the middle of having to write, I had to write to Grandma Helen about visiting this thing in this town called Huntsville, Alabama, and I'd forgotten how to write a letter H. And when I asked Mom, of course, she laughed at me, come on, you knew this when you were in school before vacation. Well, yes, there's been the chart on the wall. How could you not know this? A big grown girl like you, 9 years old, how could you? And I ended up faking it because since I could remember how to do a capital K, I ended up writing a capital K and then putting sort of a vertical squiggle up and down the right-hand side and decorating it as much as I dared so it would look like some approximation of the H. And fortunately, Mom let it pass. But I will tell you, before that, even before cursive, even with print writing and even coming into school knowing how to read, I had questions about letters, which probably were very typical dyslexic questions, but which were answered, I have to say, nonsensically. Okay, for instance, my first week, I believe, of first grade. So I would have been, nearly 6. My first year of school after kindergarten, we had worksheets. And of course, at that point, first few years of school, these would be printed worksheets, the sort of thing where you're given, let's say, lowercase f on one side of the page, and you've got to write a row of them. And you're told, make this exactly like the original. Well, as it happened, a lot of such workbooks, more then than now, but still now, have as the model for you to copy in the left side something printed, in a type font, as it might be Times New Roman or any type font you'd see in the book. So the letter F, as in freedom or whatever it was, that we had to copy. Well, what was printed was typewritten one. So when we were told, of course, to do this exactly, of course, I wasted minutes writing, the little serif, the foot under it. Not that I knew the names of everything, the thick and thin parts and the little ball at the end of the top. And of course, having this held up and laughed at, and I said, but you said to copy it exactly. And the teacher said, well, no, look at Mark. And, Mark was the best student in the class, and he'd done a perfectly good job of doing a printed F, in the way that one normally does it. He had interpreted exactly as, just print the F. Don't worry about all the little details. But they said exactly, and my mother said, do try your best. It's very important. She'd always said, please, don't be lazy. So, I was going to do it. And I said, well, how come Mark's is good and mine is bad when, Mark doesn't have the little ball thing and the little foot under it? And, I didn't know what, the terms were. You cannot blame me. Well, the teacher laughed at me and said that if there wasn't something very wrong with my eyes or my brain or perhaps even my very soul, then I would know what everyone else knew, and I would be able to look at a handwritten printed one and a printed one, see that they were exactly the same. And I was literally told, there's no ball or line or extra things there. No normal person could see it because it's not there. You have to try and look at this harder until you see it not being there, but you'll do that after you come back from the principal's office, And it was the first week of school, and I'd already been there, I think, 3 times over this sort of thing. Now, right. I want to know why has no one investigated whether others are being told that? And if so, what is the effect on perceptions of taking someone who, in fact, perceives correctly, perceives what's on the page and saying, you don't perceive it, what you see is not there, and you must try harder to, not see it being there because the normal person cannot. I mean, if there's been some explanation like, oh, you don't have to do this part, this is what you have to do. But, no one offered such an explanation. I could not ask about it. I mean, I know the terminology now, but there's no way that I can go back into my 5 or 6-year-old self and tell her, oh, well, this is what to say and you'll be understood. And if I had said it, I would not have been understood because in my experience and observation, not everyone knows type font terminology, and not even everyone who teaches handwriting knows any handwriting related terminology. I would have been unintelligible. And I've actually asked therapists when I've gone to them, well, what should I have said or done that would have prevented me from being responded to in that way, that would have gotten me responded to rationally? And they basically say, no, we don't know what you could have said. We have never encountered this. This is not a problem we study. These things are happened to you, Kate, and we believe they happen to you. But, these are not issues, that are in the books about how to be a therapist, So I wanted, and the fact that I have vision issues and have had them for much of my life, not then, but thereafter, at some point in school, I began eventually to have some serious vision problems. I've actually wondered, I could never prove this, but I've actually wondered, does some of that come from having sat there and tried so hard to see 2 very different shapes as identical, to not see what was on the page because I'm told that a real person would not see it? And that is actually the phrase that one of my teachers used. Not that teacher, but the teacher I had the year after that. I mean, what makes them think it's okay to say this?
It's
I
not.
have actually asked teachers, not those particular teachers I believe they've passed on to their reward or otherwise, but I've asked other teachers whom I've heard saying this to other children or to whom I've told my story, and they said, yes, I think I would have said it even though it wasn't good to say. I think I would have had to say it. I said, well, why? And they say, it just feels like the right thing to say. And in fact, when Facebook came along, I actually contacted some of my classmates at my various schools, who'd been there, not to blame them, but just to make contact. I'd write to them, hello, you remember me from such and such school, now I'm on Facebook, remember me? And we talk, and sometimes some of the first things they'd say was, oh my God, I apologize for what I did to you when we were 8 and we were learning how to do, a capital Q or whatever. But many of them didn't apologize. Many of them basically said, oh, you're here again, it serves you right, you should have curled up and died. Some of them said, you have to realize that it doesn't matter if you were right because the fact that you had this going on and that it was intolerable to us. And some of them actually said, even though rationally I know that I was wrong to say these things about your flaws and your failings, I don't believe that one needs to be entirely rational in life. So I think I'm justified saying so now as I did then, even though rationally I know it's wrong. Who cares about being rational? Direct quote.
Oh, well, they certainly don't sound like people you should spend too much time with. So, interestingly, we're going from being at school where effectively you're trying to be a printing press by copying all the letters exactly. But you mentioned not being...
Well, no one had told me not to be. If someone someone had simply given me a basic lesson in how writing came to be as it is, which is something I do for all my students, both when I teach them how to write, generally much more sensibly than I learned how to write, and when I teach them how to read cursive, which for some people is the only instruction they want or need, I go through the relevant bits of the history of our handwriting. If this were a video podcast, I could actually give you a demonstration. But when it comes to writing, which I was doing for years and years before a dyslexia-related incident prompted me to read cursive fast as a result of how I finally taught myself how to read cursive and write legibly many years earlier.
Before we get into the writing, how the writing come about, I want to understand how you got from the difficult time at school to realizing that you were dyslexic.
Explain this, I actually have to explain how this was related to how our writing came to be as it is in its form. So here's what happened. As I said, I was 24 in graduate school. I was living at home, and I was at home one day alone studying while my parents went out, and I was, to be at home and watch the phone and pick it up if people called, unless they were too quick and went right on the answering machine. And I was, tell them when they got back, Aunt Shirley called or Uncle Abe called or, whatever, she can't come, he's coming, he's bringing, the muffins, whatever it might have been.
Yes.
Well, normally I would just pick them up. However, since I was studying, I didn't much want to be disturbed. I would typically let it, ring a couple of times, which meant it went on the machine, which meant that I had to copy it down afterwards. And I would, normally my procedure had been to very laboriously copy it down and, and basically take 10 minutes to write out something like, Aunt Shirley called and she can't come. But on that day, since I had to type a paper and as well as study, and I had a deadline, I left on my electric typewriter because that was, before computers. So I had this electric typewriter, which was the salvation of my life at the time. And I left it on so I could type, and I was between one page and another when the phone rang. And after I had taken down Aunt Shirley called and she cannot come or whatever it was, I realized to my horror that I had been taking notes by leaving a piece of paper in the typewriter and then typing it out and then laboriously copying it into what passed for my handwriting and destroying the typescript so that my mother, wouldn't see the typescript and laugh at me, because she would have laughed at me for typing it, for having to type it. And, so I was like cutting up the evidence and ripping it up into little bitty bits after I copied it down laboriously. Well, at the time, I was in graduate school, as it happened, studying to be a librarian, living in New York City. That's where I lived then, which has some of the best archival libraries of the world, which as a library student, I was able to get into, and studying very hard for my MLS, Master's in Library Science. I found that I was stealing time from that study to go into those archives and look up literally the past 500 years of books on handwriting, copybooks and all, as far back as there had been, which was nearly 500 years at the time. And this year, in fact, it's exactly 500 years, because this year happens to be the 500th anniversary of the first known handwriting copybook that was ever published in our alphabet. Regardless. So I was literally, doing, you could almost say, was doing archaeology and stealing time from my studies. I would do my homework and then I'd, run to get the reference library to send up ancient handwriting books. Well, what I did was go through each one, basically find what parts worked, what parts didn't, how has handwriting changed over the years, from something that if you look at books 500 years ago, they're actually quite sensible. The writing in that earliest book I made, which was actually written by a Vatican scribe when he lost his scribe job to the printing press, he actually bought himself a printing press and wrote a book about how to write. Apparently his neighbors had been asking him for handwriting lessons. So bad handwriting is nothing new. And he wrote out, the script he'd been using, which at the time was a very print-like semi-joined script. Basically, the harder joins and the harder shapes really had not been in there. And really later teachers complicated things. If we ever do a video, I have a very freaky little presentation I could show you that I do show my students at this point. So I literally traced them through, going through 500 years of books getting increasingly complex, especially the 18th century British ones, which then became the American ones, or the ancestors of the American ones. I see how handwriting had happened. I could stick with the simpler kinds and I could read the complex kinds because I'd seen how it evolved. It wasn't a matter of not knowing where any of this had come from or why it had been as it was. In fact, along the way, since the simplest styles that now exist, or at least the ones that work for me, and as it turned out later for my late father, who was almost certainly an undiagnosed dyslexic, more about him in a moment, those happen to be some of the variants of the Renaissance style that we know as italics, the simpler variants. Well, when I got down to the 20th century books, I found that among all the crazy, complicated, conventional cursive ones, there were italic books from most of the English-speaking countries and some of the others. Many of them had before and after samples of the contributors, often with their letterheads. So I would look up, I'd look up their phone numbers and phone them, and I would write them, and that was how they practiced. And many of my friends and colleagues, friends I made then, many of them are still alive and are my colleagues today, now on the website. But again, this was before the web. So when I was in the library, I was also getting the reference department to pull out for me, phone books. If I found that someone lived in, let's say, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 20 years ago when a book was published, I would look up the same name in the Philadelphia phone book. And if they weren't there, I would look more widely in Pennsylvania. And then I'd basically look, basically being a detective. Today, this would all be very easy on the internet. But back then, you really had to be a detective. And I would find people, write to them. Sometimes they were dead. Sometimes they were not dead. It was amazing. And I found all sorts of people, not only teachers, but believe it or not, I even found MDs, physicians with legible handwriting who gained it the italic way. So I decided, that's it. I found the Society for Italic Handwriting. I joined them. And it was against a lot of opposition. It was believed folks like me couldn't write, or that somehow if we did, it would somehow be easiest if we all did it in cursive and never picked up the pen. That's such a big belief, but I've never found an actual adult dyslexic who believes that belief. Now, I said I was my first student. My father was the undiagnosed dyslexic who was my second student. Now, he's been born in 1931, basically at the heyday of complicated cursive in the USA, and you did not learn how to print at all. And he had been a washout. He and a cousin of his had been the two worst writers in the school. And frankly, to make a very long story short, he had a teacher who used to enjoy bullying both of them every day. My father was the worst child. And from everything I saw and from everything he tells me, he's gone now, but it would be what is now called dyslexia. His cousin Larry was the second worst writer, and they were usually in the same class in the same year at school. And when they were in the third year of school, their teacher was Mrs. Murphy, who, as my father remembered it, and he never tired of telling the story, stood 6 feet high with, scales on her body and fangs and eyes like Bunsen burners, and was 60 feet high and, and breathed fire. Yeah. Well, that's how we remembered her. And every day they would have handwriting, and she'd collect everyone's handwriting. And first she would start in on my father's cousin on his mother's side, the second worst handwriting in the school, Larry Goldberg. And she'd go on for Larry Goldberg, who's also gone, probably was also dyslexic, but not as much as Dad. And she'd go on, Larry Goldberg, your writing is a stench from the pit of perdition. How can you call yourself a decent human American and walk around on two legs when you are a living offense to all that is human and decent and literate? And she'd go on. Well, she was Mrs. Murphy. She had the proverbial gift of the gab. I mean, she'd probably kissed the Blarney Stone quite a lot in her life and was using it for evil rather than for good. But anyway, she'd have these 10 or 15 minute very oratorical rants, which she would wind up with by saying, in fact, Larry Goldberg, the disgusting mess that you so call your handwriting, so to speak, is worse than anything that has ever seared the eyesight out of my eyeballs, except for the writing of your cousin Ernie over there. That being Ernest Gladstone, my dad. So when people talk about how teachers' influence never really ends, that's not always benevolent. It can work both ways. There's a lot of dyslexia on it. Seems to be mostly on my father's side of the family. His handwriting was almost identical to his, and certainly his experiences just shut up anyone who says, they say, oh, if we all wrote only in cursive, all these dyslexic people would be saved and not bad writers. Well, if my dad is listening up in heaven, or if there is a heaven or anything, he would have something to say to that. And you know who else would? If you have ever read the first ever published case history of dyslexia, which was published in the 1870s in the British Medical Journal, and that was, patient one. That's the case of someone who was taught entirely in cursive, because that's how one was taught. The samples of his writings are in this article are entirely in cursive, because that's simply what one learned. And those samples are full of reversals and everything else. We're talking about, those samples are full of reversals and everything else. We're talking about someone who at age 15 spelled his own first name, Percy, Precy, in cursive, and not even too bad looking cursive. So don't go talking to me about, and cursive would prevent all these reversals. And no way, it did not, it did not work. If it didn't work for someone who was learning only cursive and who was so dyslexic that he was the first documented case, why would it work for anyone today? I have to tell you, when I show this to people who are of what I call the cursive worshiping school of thought, and now there are people who want this, at every single day of school, day one through grade one, and they say how it would prevent dyslexia or cure dyslexia. When I show them this, they don't want to believe it. There have been people who literally have said to me, how dare this be true? Literally, that phrase was used at one point, and I've heard this from more than one person. Now, I don't know what that makes, but it's incredible what goes on. I've seen individuals with dyslexia with whom I worked who improved. One case that I worked with over a week and a half over her summer vacation, because that was the time she was 16 years old, and her teachers were certainly on her case about handwriting worse every year. It turned out that an examination she'd have to take was adding a handwritten essay, so, which had not been expected. So I'd been called in because she'd always been told for all these years, oh, well, your handwriting doesn't really matter. Handwriting can't matter. This is the modern age. Actually, it did matter not only because she was facing that exam, but her career plans were to be a medical missionary. And, some of the places she might be sent, there would not be, at the time, there would not have been, computers. Now it might be a little different, but foreseeably then there would not have been. Well, I worked with her, and after I worked with her, she then saw a different dyslexia tutor whom she was seeing for other subjects. A tutor who'd been taken off the case for handwriting because her handwriting had gotten worse with this tutor, but the tutor was very good at all sorts of other things, math and science and history. So she was still seeing the tutor for those after I left, and was no longer seeing the tutor for handwriting, but the tutor, whom I will call Mrs. McNasty, which was not her name, but really should have been. Mrs. McNasty, was very upset at having been taken off the case because Mrs. McNasty had all kinds of fancy letters after her name from a dyslexia training institute that had told her exactly what to do, and she had done it, although the student had not responded well when it came to handwriting, although it had worked well for all sorts of other things. Well, anyway, one day, my former student, whom I will call Kitty, again, not her name, although close to it, was arriving at Mrs. McNasty's home office for her lesson in, I think it was in algebra or whatever it was. And she was waiting and writing in her journal as she was waiting. Now that writing was fun, she was keeping a journal. And Mrs. McNasty, opened the waiting room door, to call her in, and looked over her shoulder where she was writing and said, "Oh, Kitty, oh, come on, dear. You can't possibly be writing as nicely as all that," while Kitty was in the act of writing.
Yeah, what?
Now, it takes, shall we say, a very special sort of teacher to look at someone who is doing something, to see that the person is now doing it well, and to say, "Oh, you can't possibly be doing that." It takes a very special sort of teacher, and that special sort of teacher is not one that I would like anyone to have to be taught by. So it's unsurprising that this was Kitty's last day with Mrs. McNasty.
Yes, I can imagine. So interestingly, how have you found, obviously you mentioned quite a lot with cursive writing, and I remember one of my classic things with cursive writing was to basically drag the pen so badly that you couldn't tell I'd made all the letters wrong.
Well, I thought of intentionally doing things wrong, and many people do, particularly with dyslexia, but I couldn't stomach the thought of, intentionally messing up worse than I was already. That seemed, very much out of bounds to me, although I was tempted. I've known people who do it. In fact, I see it a lot with my students. If they have an issue with spelling, for instance, if they don't remember in the word thief, does the I go before the E or does the E go before the I? They will intentionally do it in cursive and do it very badly so that you can't tell if the I is A or the E is an I, and you'll position the dots somewhere in between them so that no one can tell, and they hope to get the benefit of the doubt. Now, I never did that, and of course, when one learns italic, one cannot do that because italic is so much clearer. Believe it or not, I actually know calligraphers who do splendid italic and who are diagnosed dyslexics like me, and in many cases found out only after they'd already finally become good writers through some laborious process that they couldn't. In fact, I have more than one seen neurologists who basically were amazed because apparently my students and I are not supposed to happen. Literally not supposed to happen. Fortunately, I have had recently a couple of researchers asking to talk to me, so there may be things in print, but it was like pulling teeth to get to researchers. Now, this all ties into the matter of reading cursive. So I had not initially set out to learn to read cursive because I figured, I'll work on writing as possible. But working through the history of our handwriting enabled me to find commonalities that I've been told did not exist between printed and cursive shapes, even the very screwy, elaborate ones we've got in the USA. If you've ever seen a typical North American cursive model, capital G, you'll know exactly what I mean.
Yes.
And I had been told when I asked, this is arbitrary, it was just invented and no one knows by whom or how, all of which is, total bogus. In other words, it's known. My teacher did not know, but there's no excuse for that. I had to find out the hard way. I would like to be the person and to be the author of the book that was not there for me, so that it should be there for the rising generation. If my book sells well this year, which has been a bit difficult because of the pandemic, then I'll get to keep it in print from my publisher. She'll let me do that. And then we can do the other books, basically, which are the actual writing ones. So I'm hoping that this podcast will make a dent. But I acquired cursive incidentally through learning handwriting history, whereas the way I was expected to have acquired it incidentally was supposed to be, I suppose either by magic or by simply writing it over and over and over and over again, which worked for a great many people. It did not work for me. I think it worked for almost everyone in the class except for the other undiagnosed dyslexic with whom I've lost touch over the years. In any case, I teach people how it happens. Sometimes a few basics are helpful to disentangle the simpler letters. For instance, I'm always asked, particularly by dyslexics and anyone else, what I call the disabilities, DYS abilities, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia. Well, how come when we've got cursive, the lowercase m has got 3 bumps, but in any other writing, it only has 2 bumps? And what I point out is the secret is you've got to not look at the bumps. You've got to look at the downstrokes, because the first of the bumps is only there to get you into the letter from the previous letter if there was one. So M, lowercase m as in monkey, has 3 downstrokes, whether it's printed, cursive, or, anything else you've ever seen. Lowercase n as in nothing has 2 downstrokes, again, no matter what it is. And then, of course, when you go into the capitals, I mentioned the North American cursive, typical conventional North American cursive capital G, which of course you can Google the phrase if you are really morbidly curious. If you were to look at it, a capital G and a capital S in conventional North American cursive, you would wonder, what badness is this? They do not look at first glance like anything like the letters that they are supposed to be. In fact, they look much closer to each other than to either of those letters, because the only difference is like a little tiny peak, a little tiny spur somewhere on the upper right-hand corner. But if you look at how they originated, if you look at cursive books down through the ages, as our cursive was changing from simple Renaissance cursive to complex present-day cursive, you see that there was an originally simple form that got buried in all sorts of added-on curlicues to get you into the top of the letter G and out of the bottom. You'll see that proportions changed at some point. They changed exactly what portions of it would fit on the line or not. And once you see this, you'll never forget. Now, it used to be only dyslexic people were forgetting. Now it's everybody, because now, even though perhaps 20 of the USA's 50 states still do teach cursive, and a greater number are expecting people to write cursive in school, whether they were taught it or not, which doesn't work, of course, you find that most people have not grown up seeing a lot of cursive, so even if they don't have any particular impediments, they also don't have that incidental learning because they haven't seen it. In my day, like it or not, even if you couldn't write at all or didn't write at all, you saw cursive everywhere, and better, you saw it in the act of being written. Practically every day of the week, my mother or my father would be sitting at home writing letters, business letters. They might be to the bank or the grocery store or the electric company or to my school or they might be personal letters to a relative. Things that nowadays would be done by email or messaging or probably by phone. But, back then there were certain letters you just didn't, where it just was not considered proper to phone someone up. And even if it was, phone calls to another city or state could be very expensive. So often you didn't, so even people who have never written cursive, had never written cursive, would have seen quite a lot of it in the act of being written. Today, our exposure would be minimal. In other words, we probably see more of those weird type fonts in video games than we see of any version of cursive whatsoever. So people who are taught it often don't acquire it or are literally forgetting it. There was actually an investigative report in Canada about how numerous children who were taught cursive at about age 8, standard for North America, by the time they're age 18, they cannot read cursive, let alone write it any more than people who were in some other part of Canada and who were never taught. So there's a natural experiment right there from knowing such people through my work, not necessarily in Canada. I only was in Canada once for work, but knowing such people and talking with them, I'm convinced that's because they're taught by rote without understanding. If you learn to memorize, this is a capital G and you don't know why, you'll forget that in a snap. But if you know how it happened, you'll remember it. You'll remember it forever.
Is that pretty much the crux? Is that pretty much the crux of your program, really?
That's the crux of it. This is what happens in the book. Section 1 goes through every lowercase letter and then every uppercase letter, teaching you what you have to know to decode them, giving you some practice. Initially, very short words such as ice, because the first chapter includes the lowercase ICE, and then building up until you're reading things that use all the alphabet letters. Then in the second section, give you some reading practice in a format I call cursive stories, which are simply a few short stories. And the first sentence of each story is in a font that looks like a rather casual handwritten printing. Each successive sentence after that adds one more or several more features of conventional cursive. Very gradually, you get more loops, more connections. So you're going to an unjoined writing, to an unjoined italic, to a joined italic, to a Baroque italic, to a fancy classical era cursive, getting fancier. So by the bottom of every story, you are reading very complex cursive indeed, but you didn't have to learn it by being plunged into it overnight, which is what happens at school. You go home Friday one day when you're 8, and you come back Monday and they've changed all the handwriting charts and you've got all new books, and they changed the alphabet while you slept. How much fun is that? Instead of throwing you in the deep end of the Olympic-sized wading pool and teaching you and hoping you'll pick up how to swim, we've got you in the wading pool, not in the Olympic-sized pool, but in, the wading pool. I think you would call it the paddling pool, with just a couple of inches deep at one end. Yeah. And you spin, and eventually you're floating, and then you're swimming. Now, yes. How would you rather be taught anything new? By going from the known to the unknown in discernible steps, or by having someone say, "Hello, welcome back to school. We've changed everything." If you went to work at your day job and you came back after the weekend and your employer had changed the alphabet, you would quit. And if you didn't quit, they would fire you. Well, children can't quit school and we can't fire them. All they can do is sit there. I give you lots of life hacks. In fact, I actually have about 7 life hacks for handwriting technique that I've actually boiled down to what I call my quick start 7, which I recently put on readcursivefast.com because I'm starting to add a little writing. Fortunately, most of those tips have to be illustrated, but I'll give you such tips as I can convey orally. And they will sound ridiculous. They will sound like something out of Monty Python, like this is obvious, but they're really not. For instance, one tip I would like to give you is finish each letter before starting the next one. And this sounds like, oh, obvious. Who doesn't do that? Well, you know who doesn't do that? Anyone who was sort of brainwashed into keep your pen on the paper at all times, because then you've got to get to the end of the word before you then trek all the way backwards to put in the dots on the I and J and cross the T and cross the X. That is supposed to be faster, but if you actually time people doing that versus doing the other way, if that's the only variable they change, people who follow that rule waste a lot more time on their handwriting than if they broke just their one rule. So if you have a word like joyful or topic, words I use as examples, or xylophone if we want a nice long word, or jelly bean, when you write a letter that needs the dot or cross, rather than wait till all the end of the word jelly bean or tyrannosaurus or xylophone or, whatever, or tomato, you would say tomato, or whatever it be, write the letter, pick the letter up, and very often, in the case of a letter T, for instance, 9 times out of 10, you'll then be able to use the cross of that letter as a join into your next letter. And if you do that, you're saving time on literally every word you write with one of those letters. Now, here is another thing. A lot of noise in handwriting is made about lead-in strokes, and the cursive worshipers talk about how you need them for handwriting. Now, one of the best pieces of handwriting news I ever heard coming out of the UK was that your Ministry of Education has decided to abolish those lead-in and those entry strokes. And I would say, keep clear of unneeded strokes at the beginnings and ends of letters. For instance, if you've got a word like up, and if most of us, if we're taught a continuous cursive, either as our first method or as common in the USA at about age 8, we're taught, start from the baseline and go up and do the letter U and do the letter P and have a join coming out to point to the next letter. Well, those joins take time and they make it harder to read the letter. Even if you know cursive, you have to, so to speak, chop your way through the thicket to read what's there. So Start the letter where the letter starts. Start the U at the top. End the P with the letter PS. When you go to the bottom and close it. Find out where you can apply this without making the letter illegible, and you'll see it's more legible indeed.
Yes.
I would also say that some joins. Yes, I'm only giving you a few of the tips, only those that I can convey, orally. Some of them do require illustrations. Now, here's the big one, and this, pie in the face to all you conventional cursive worshipers. And I don't know what it's like in England. Well, I have some idea. But in the USA, there are so many cursive worshipers that various journalists and I myself have literally caught out state legislators lying about what was in handwriting research in order to make it support cursive. Some of them have actually been caught out and exposed in the newspapers, but have gone on to say that they were proud of what they did and would do it again, even after they were caught out. Be that as it may,
that's not helpful.
The reason people worry about joins and not joining in handwriting, and the reason that in America we have this ridiculous thing where first you are never allowed to join any letter, and then suddenly you've got to join all of them, as opposed to the Renaissance where joins were optional, they were sensible, and you used them where they worked. In fact, that very first handwriting book I told you about, it was written in Italy, but one of its key sentences of instruction reads, translated into English, to join or not to join, I leave up to you. 500 years ignored. Why can't we say, well, anyway, the problem that people say, joins are faster. Yes, they're supposed to be. They might, but are they? Some joins are much faster than just picking up the pen, but some are much slower to the point of being accident prone. If you have the word oil, for instance, the join from the O to the I is, usually quite easy. If you have the word aim, the join from the A to the I is very often quite easy. But suppose you have the word light. From G to H, it's very difficult. Your pen is constantly changing direction. In fact, the 18th and 19th century cursive instructors had the term compound curve, which literally meant simply a curve. That's really the most difficult one in handwriting, as even they admitted. Something that's convex and then it changes to be concave, you're always having to make this course corrections. Or if you have the word let's say you have the word quest, Quest, if you have to join everything, then what ends up with the Q is, well, some models of handwriting in the UK have just a straight line that goes up, but it's a bit hard to read. In the USA, we have something that's supposed to make it easier to read, but that actually doesn't. That's a ridiculous sort of little bow tie that comes out from the Q to the U. But in either case, it's a bit of a stretch, a bit of a time waster. Why not write the Q, get to the bottom of the tail, make a little flick on the end of it if you think that helps it not look like a 9, but then pick up and go right to the U. Or if you have P to A, now that's really difficult. Consider the word pan, for instance, going from the bottom of the rounded portion of the P, the counter, as we call it in handwriting speak, to the top of the counter of the A. You're going, right, you're going right and concave and up and convex. And it's very difficult. It breaks down so quickly at speed that ever since World War II, in fact, there's been research on stroke survivors and people with neurological issues of any kind, often caused by accidents, such as stroke or war injuries, that finds that basically this is the most accident-prone thing to happen in handwriting, and it's the thing that someone with a little bit of a brain difference that affects handwriting or coordination. But in any case, since that is so difficult to do well at speed that even if you watch someone who does a conventional cursive and joins all the letters and who does it quite well, they are always slowing down if they do it well. If they speed up, the join starts being distorted or slicing through the letter or gets left out. I have to say, I have actually been told that a lot of what I do is basically, I've been told by professionals that what I do works but is unacceptable because it theoretically should not work. My response to that is that if your theory says that what works should not work, you had better change your theory. But the thing was, I acquired the ability to write cursive through going through italic and seeing what was happening to italic and extrapolating from there as I read the rest of the books over 500 years of history. In fact, I have, as a handwriting teacher, once or twice, actually twice, I've actually taught people to write a continuous conventional cursive if that's what they wanted. If they had their heart set on that, but they came to me, I would teach them this, but I always told them, as I'm telling you, that if you want to write that, if that's a nice option for you and you think it's nice looking and you just want to do it, the best way to approach it is through the way that conventional cursive happened. Start with italic and move on through history from there. And then you will be able to do it very easily. Once you learn the basics of italic, there are only a few changes you have to make. I like to think of italic. Well, living in the USA, I think of italic as being like the Grand Central Station in New York City that all the trains go into and come out of. I think the British equivalent would be Euston Station in the Underground. Am I correct? Where all the trains go into it and come out of it at some point, right?
Yeah, Euston, Waterloo, yeah.
One of those. I've only been in the UK once. I was on my honeymoon and I was on the Underground once. So I think I was through Euston Station, but if there are bigger ones, whatever is the biggest underground station. In other words, once you're on the train to italic and you reach italic, that's halfway to anywhere. You can start with italic and you can get from there to the earlier medieval script. You can get to the later modern cursives. You can get to any form of printing you care to name. It's sort of a greatest common factor that you can add to. Almost like having a soup base. And once you get your basic soup recipe, you can add all the different flavors and vegetables you want, depending on what you're trying to do with your basics. So I have always taught people, write italic, we learn to read cursive handwriting because it's out there. Learn it concurrently with writing italic so you can write more sensibly yourself. And I'm not saying it has to be with a fancy italic pen italic. I'm not, Philip Hensher, the missing ink. I do calligraphy, but that doesn't mean everyone else has to. But I'm not like fill a pen through the missing ink, who has like 3 whole chapters complaining about fancy pens. Do it with a plain old ordinary pen. You might like one of those fancy italic. I love italic pens and markers because they're a broader surface with which to write, and they make the writing more legible by emphasizing those thicks and thins. I get a little bit of what we get in typewritten letters, type fonts, which have those thicks and thins and other things, basically to replicate handwriting done with the old-fashioned italic edged pen. Not many people know that. Some students told me that, rather than ridiculing me over the lowercase letter f, why not say, well, those bits happen because our printed fonts are really handwriting fonts from an old kind of handwriting that was done with this particular kind of pen, which made these things happen in the handwriting. But we don't have to do that, and we've got pencils, And so let's give you a model with a pencil and have you do it. Why not do it that way? I'm only saying we need to teach handwriting as sensibly as any other subject, and that dyslexics, anyone with the DYS abilities, suffers worse from anything that goes wrong in education, and handwriting is no exception. If there are people who believe in providence and destiny and everything happens for a reason, I will not claim to be one of these people because there are too many scary things in the world that it's hard to see a reason for. But if anything happens for a reason, it might be that dyslexia, dyspraxia, and dysgraphia happen for a reason. And it might even be that autism spectrum happens for a reason, because people with these and other neurological disabilities are like the canary in the coal mine. The miners in the old days would take down their pet canaries in a little cage because if there was a problem with the air, if there was no oxygen, bad air, the canary would keel over and faint and maybe die before the miner did. So the miner had time to go out and make a report that the ventilation needed to be improved. And it could be like we are like that if we are ordinary students, only more so. Whatever doesn't work well for another student will work 10 times as badly for us. So we are the early warning system, I think, for all the rest. If you want to make something that works for everyone in terms of teaching literacy, handwriting, comprehension of cursive, whatever, make it so that all the dyslexics can learn it, and make it so all the dyspraxics and dysgraphics can learn it, and then you'll find that everybody can learn it.
Yes. What it's like the assistive technology world. What works for dyslexics tends to roll out and work quite well for other people.
Yeah. Even though I have a very high percentage of dyslexics, I have a very high percentage of anyone who has any kind of inborn variation, left-handers, both the normal and those who've been punished into being imitation right-handers, and yes, that still goes on. I will tell you, about all my doctor classes, there was a very high percentage of dyslexics, because did you know that a very high percentage of dyslexics go into certain fields in medicine, and that those fields are predominantly radiology and to a slightly lesser extent surgery? And did you know why? This was actually pointed out to several of my doctor students who were dyslexic and who were radiologists or surgeons. Dyslexics tend to be very good at spatial visualization in 3D. And this is exactly what you need if you're a radiologist, and you'll be looking at x-rays all day to try to find what part of a certain organ that's behind a certain other organ that showed up on the x-ray has something wrong with it. And it's what you will need for surgery, to be aware of how all the organs fit together, because none of us is built quite like the textbooks. There's always a little variation inside. And people who have great visual spatial perception skills, if they can do well enough at school at all to get through medical school, they have a much easier time in radiology and surgery than a lot of the people who sign up to specialize in radiology or surgery. And this is what I've been told repeatedly by those MDs who were dyslexic, who were among my students, many, if not all of whom were radiologists and surgeons. At a certain point, it became conspicuous to me how many dyslexics there were diagnosed or otherwise probable, although as doctors, most of them had been diagnosed because doctors get themselves diagnosed, and how many of those people in turn were radiologists or surgeons.
Yes. The internal picture thinking is something that's a really strong dyslexic strength. Hence why they're really good as engineers and think STEM subjects like that as well.
And of course, you can see how that strength interfered. Back when I was in the first grade and I was asking about letter shapes, and someone who did not see all the dimensions, was unfortunately not sympathetic, was not standing in my shoes, was not empathetic to my point of view. And of course, think about three-dimensional writing. If you're joining every single letter within a word, that makes the word two-dimensional. It's just a flat pattern on a piece of paper. But if your hand gets lift up and return, lift up and return, lift up and return, it's three-dimensional, and you can take advantage of that. And there is that much more of a feature for the dyslexic mind to grasp hold of.
Yes. So that brings me really to sort of starting to wind the podcast up. And I have three questions I ask every guest on the podcast. So I'm going to ask them to you and see what your answers are. So the first question is, what prejudice do you have about dyslexia that's been proven wrong?
Theories of, what do I know has been proven wrong about dyslexia? Well, first and foremost, the notion that people with dyslexia, are silly or stupid. That has been proven wrong for a long time, but it needs to be proven wrong again and again in every generation because people forget. Another thing probably got in the way of diagnosis for me and for many others is that for many decades there was a belief that dyslexia was only or mostly in boys, and that or only or mostly in left-handed people, or that it was caused by something environmental. And we know that this is not so, but even though most people, and I would say everyone in the field probably knows it's not just boys, for instance, even though there probably are more boys than girls who are dyslexic or more men than women, but certainly nothing so exclusive. The problem is that consequences of that decision still remain. There's at least one private school for dyslexia in the United States that for many years was only a boys' school, even though they had many girls wanting to apply. They didn't want to a girls' school until they had some particular number of girls, and it turned out to be because there were people on the staff who still had the old theory that it was just boys and they didn't want to have a girls' school.
Yes.
So, your next question.
My next question. If an alien came down and asked you what dyslexia was, how would you describe it to them?
I would say dyslexia is a matter of the perceptual system being able to perceive and attaching significance to sensory inputs that people without dyslexia filter out, don't notice, and vice versa, that we may not notice some of the sensory inputs that others have noticed, and that this happens because of how we perceive. I would speculate, for instance, as is speculated by some very good dyslexia groups in the USA, such as Davis Dyslexia Association International, which, by the way, has written a lovely review of my book, Read Cursive Fast. They will point out to you that in the millennia before writing, the millions of years really before there was writing or reading, what was important was to recognize an object in the environment, even if it was camouflaged or hidden behind bushes. You want to be able to recognize the lion that's crouching in the bushes, whether its head is pointed to the right or pointed to the left. You want to immediately notice that this is a lion, no matter what way it's facing and no matter what it's looking at, or it's going to be looking at you, sure enough, and then where are you? Now, the problem is when writing as we know it comes along, because of how we end up forming letters and what letter shapes and joins are the ones we end up writing in various alphabets, things have different names when they're turned in different directions. A lion is still a lion whether he's facing east or west. But if you have a letter B and a letter D, they are certainly different depending on how they're facing. And the more so if you have one of these horrendous beginner primary ball and stick fonts. But believe it or not, there are reversals in cursive. If you look at many cursives, particularly the North American ones, the uppercase cursive J is an exact reversal of the lowercase cursive F, as in freedom. And very often when you see dyslexics trying to write in cursive, they will reverse part or all of the letter. One of my problems as a dyslexic struggling with cursive if I was trying to remember how to write a letter from memory because I needed to write the word life, for instance. There was one time I had to write it on some poster or project I was doing, and it ended up looking like some very crude version of lowercase l, lowercase I, capital J, lowercase e, total nonsense. Because I remembered how the top of it went, but I couldn't remember which way the bottom of it went. So my explanation would be that there is a perceptual difference, that things that are obvious to dyslexics are non-obvious to others and vice versa. And that this is one reason we need all kinds of minds, because one person will perceive what the others haven't. If our alien was familiar with colorblindness, for instance, I'd use this as an analogy. In World War II, before certain mechanical camouflage detection methods were created, one thing they used to do to detect camouflage was when they would send up the scouting planes, they would try to have two people on each plane. One aviator would be someone with, typical normal vision, and the other would be colorblind, because a colorblind person can see some gradations of gray that a typical person cannot. Things will stand out to a colorblind person that don't stand out to me. I'm not colorblind. I don't know if you are, but that won't stand out to a typical person. And things will stand out to the typical person that are invisible to the colorblind person. So this is why it's a great advantage to us to have all kinds of minds. And of course, we want any kind of mind to be reasonably competent with what the other kinds of minds do, just because we all live in the same world. Just as, to use a cooking analogy, we are not all going to be cordon bleu chefs. We are not all going, to work at Chez Panisse or some fancy French place that gets 5 stars, in Michelin, but it's to our advantage to all learn how to make, soup and a sandwich. For some of us, more difficult than others. But in any good restaurant, they will have a fellow who specializes in the soups and is not so great with the sandwiches. And they'll have someone who specializes in the sandwiches and is not so great with the soups. And it's better to have a variety of abilities along with whatever common ground we can all have than to have everybody be all the same. And this is what I would say, that this is why it matters that there is dyslexia. I am sometimes asked if there's a cure for dyslexia or for anything else neurological. I might say, well, maybe some things there are people who have them want and need a cure for. But for any of the things I have, which include the disabilities, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, and for the other thing I happen to have, which is autism spectrum syndrome, I wouldn't want a cure so much as a working on and off switch. I'd like to be able to turn my dyslexia perceptions on when I needed it and off when I didn't, and the same for all the other things. And, some people like the Davis people, have made some strides, they say, in those areas. What they do has not worked so great for me, but I was rather old when I heard about all this. Those things may have worked well for others. But I'd say that one thing we can do, given that we don't really have a magical on and off switch for our dyslexia, and I would, as I say, love to get one installed, I would say that if you learn how cursive handwriting came to be and what makes an A in whatever style, what makes a B in whatever style, you are then using the dyslexic strength of pattern recognition. You are able to see a lowercase s or an uppercase G or whatever it may be through the thicket of add-ons, just as any dyslexic of old who was a superb hunter could see right through the underbrush and see the lion that was hiding where maybe no other member of the tribe could see it.
So the final question of the podcast, and seeing as this is called the Dyslexia Life Hacks Show, although you mentioned quite a lot of life hacks earlier, I just want to see what your favorite dyslexia life hack is outside of the handwriting.
Outside of the handwriting business, matters, one of my favorite dyslexia life hacks is that whenever I get a piece of paper that has something I will need to attend to at a future time, I photograph it and I email it to myself. That way, if I lose the piece of paper or I can't find it, and for some reason losing and misplacing things is extraordinarily common with so many of us who have these DYS disabilities, that way at least I'll have it and I won't have to risk papers piling up and my having to go through each and every one, because I can email it to myself with a subject line. In fact, better yet, now that the Apple company has upgraded the software on their iPhones and their iPads, I can add to that hack because, believe it or not, the current software actually will read text and will very often even read handwriting, yes, even cursive handwriting in a photograph. So the dental assistant can give me a scribbled date on a card for my next appointment, and I can photograph that, and I can copy and paste the text and mail it to myself. I don't have to look at it and type it into my organizer. And I will tell you, even though the software makes some errors, and they happen to be dyslexic errors, they are not many, and I'm familiar with dyslexic areas. So looking at it right then, I can correct it. If I have to correct, 1 in 20 letters on a document because it spells June with an extra E or something stupid like that, I can still do it. So my favorite life hack is let technology work for you. And in this specific instance, emailing stuff to yourself is a great way to make sure that you will have it.
Yes, no, that's a great hack, and it's great how good modern iPhones are. Well, I'd like to take the time to thank you very much for coming on this episode and sharing your stories about handwriting and how it's come to be and how your program is. It's been really interesting.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everybody else for taking the time to listen. I will see you guys in the next episode. Goodbye for now.